Hi, my name is Steven, and in honor of Traumatic Brain Injury Awareness Month, or Brain Injury Awareness Month, we wanted to do a talk about, caring for combat wounds, looking at specifically, veterans, and, how traumatic brain injury affects them. So just a short description of what we're going to be doing. Veterans is a very unique population, and, we want to talk about what makes it a little bit different than, civilian populations. And a lot of this difference is based upon their experience. So some of the stuff we're going to go over here has been some stuff about how TBI survivors, veteran TBI survivors, understand and overcome barriers. And I think it'd be important to help give, especially caregivers or professionals in this field, a better understanding of what the veteran traumatic brain injury experience is like. So just a quick agenda. Basically, we're going to go over our objectives, some of the topics. We're going to look at, military traumatic brain injuries, blast traumatic brain injuries, and then veterans' experience with traumatic brain injuries, and then closing out on some caregivers and what that experience is like for caregivers of veteran survivors. Then I'll have some resources linked and then my references. So with the objectives, I'm going to, identify important aspects of the veteran's experience. Describe what makes it unique, especially with blast-related traumatic brain injuries, which is, more common with military and difficult to find outside the military. Not completely unknown outside the military, but is most common with the military. And then discuss the role of the caregiver, because when we get to that section, you'll see that there's a big difference between military caregivers for veterans with TBIs compared to civilians. So first of all, I just want to give a basic definition of what a traumatic brain injury is. It's a direct blow or jolt to the head that causes injury. It can be a penetrating head injury or even exposure to external forces such as blast waves that disrupt the function of the brain. So these are usually defined as mild, moderate, or severe, and there's a bunch of different scales that look at how we're defining them. Some of them are coma scales, some of them are loss of conscious scales. So there's a bunch of different ways to classify mild, moderate, or severe. Mild are generally what we consider concussions, usually fall in the mild traumatic brain injury. So looking at military traumatic brain injuries. Traumatic brain injuries is described as a signature injury of the war in Iraq and Afghanistan. I mean, we're looking at a lot of veterans coming back, and is most prevalent with the improvised explosive devices. It's not exactly something new. If you're looking back in World War I, World War II, Vietnam, Korean, etc., there's always been traumatic brain injuries, but the reason that it's changing and it's becoming, more of an issue is that more veterans are surviving, and this has a lot to do with advancing technology. The body armors are able to survive bombs and rocket attacks, new helmets and new all gear and new life-saving measures. So this is increasing the survivability of veterans in combat zones, but however, it's also bringing back people with traumatic brain injuries that we, need to be able to work with and help. So, talk specifically with military TBI, combat concussions often coexist with post-traumatic stress. Deployment is very stressful. I've had one deployment in Afghanistan, and you're talking about an entire time over there where you're not sure whether the rockets are going to land in. There's machine gun fire happening all around you, and there's improvised explosive devices going off. So creates an environment of stress, and we know that stress, if it happens for a long enough period of time, actually alters the chemical structure of your brain. So you're having possible brain injuries due to, the chronic stress, as well as then having a traumatic brain injury on top of that, and creates additional complications. So within the military population, looking at gender and age distributions are different than the civilian population, where within, the general population, you're looking at children and older adults with the most traumatic brain injuries, but within the military, you're looking at people between the ages of 18 and, we'll say, 45. So that, and that's a bit different. And gender is more prone to have more males in the military than females, so, you have a little bit different gaps there. Military populations tend to be healthier. They tend to eat, breathe, and sleep physical training, so, being physically fit can help with recovery, so sometimes that improves some of the outcomes. And then we're going to talk about less often subject to severe substance abuse issues, and this has a lot to do with the mandated treatment programs, and it's a requirement for deployable conditions. So you're talking about monthly drug testing, and then even before you go deploy to a foreign country, you're going to be tested for drugs as well. So one of those factors that they consider in not allowing you to deploy. So and comes to a report. However, the concern with substance abuse generally starts to come when, veterans are leaving active duty and going into the civilian life, that, there's less controls for substance abuse. So that's where substance abuse tends to rise with military populations, is after they leave the military. So some of the concerns with reporting is the biggest one is stigma. And, you usually think of this one with the psychological issues, but it also affects with traumatic brain injuries as well. I mean, sometimes you're concerned of being forced out of their unit or even out of the Army. So, you're not always prone to reporting that, you had a traumatic brain injury. I used to work for the Defense and Veterans Brain Injury Centers, and one of the things that they talked about there was that, people were reporting their traumatic brain injury 5 to 6 years after it happened, especially ones in a deployed zone, because they didn't want to be forced out of the unit. Another concern is they don't want to let their battle buddies down. You're out there as a group, as a family, as a unit, and you don't want to, disappoint the other members there. So you don't always want to report. And then I think the other one is that you don't always recognize the symptoms. I mean, this isn't necessarily unique to military populations, but a lot of athletes, they don't want to be taken out of a game. They don't want to stop playing. They don't want to stop doing something, and they don't always recognize the symptoms in themselves. And I think military members aren't the same reason. They don't want to be taken out of their environment, and they don't always recognize the symptoms. And this can be a lot of work for the medic to identify the symptoms of a concussion. All they're concerned with is it's all self-report to diagnose concussion. A lot of research is being done on trying to determine, more objective ways, either, blood test or eye tracking, and then some other EEG type testing to look at it so that it can get more objective than the subjective way of just self-reporting, concussion symptoms. So how common? I mean, as we just mentioned before, it's a signature injury, a leading injury among U.S. forces serving in Afghanistan and Iraq. It affects both active duty and reserve service members, and then they're both at increased risk over civilian peers. In 2008, the Department of Defense reported that 7 out of 10 traumatic brain injuries were due to blasts. So, and then you're looking at deployed environment, and more than 1 in 10 were due to falls. 1 in 20 were due to vehicle accidents. 1 in 20 were due to fragments, which is, usually associated with that blast, with the fragments flying off from that. And then the rest were due to, other causes. The Army reported that 82% of the traumatic brain injury were in the mild. So they're living with, some of these are living with long-term health consequences of that brain injury. 6% were in the moderate, and another 6% in severe. The Defense and Veterans Brain Injury Center, puts this out every quarter, I believe, and this is the most up-to-date data that they have since 2000. Between 2000 and 2018, there have been 383,000 traumatic brain injuries within the military, which is a rather large number, and a lot of them are living with, some of the long-term health effects of that. Next, we wanted to talk about some blast-related traumatic brain injury. And as I said, this is more unique to the military population. And it's happening in an environment with a lot of chronic stress, and that leads to brain changes by stress alone, and then brain changes due to the blast. There are 4 primary mechanisms in a blast-related traumatic brain injury, and you're looking at the primary one being results from the overpressure of the wave hitting the body. Secondary results from, the flying debris and bomb fragments, so looking at debris and fragments, anything that's picked up and thrown. Tertiary, results from being thrown from the blast, so you're hitting an object or you're being thrown into a wall or bounced around inside a vehicle and things like that. And then the quaternary, which is basically any other related, so anything due to nothing listed above. So if the explosion causes a fire and there's fire injuries, so you have all that. So it's not just the traumatic brain injury, it's just that you have all these other additional factors that are associated with it. So this graphic I thought was helpful, just kind of really showing, basically the different levels of the blast traumatic brain injury. With the primary, you've seen that at that initial explosion. And with that blast wave, the secondary, you can see all the particles that are out there. And then you're looking at tertiary, basically looking at any impact from where the body lands or body getting thrown to. And then it doesn't really get at the quaternary ones, but that would be if they were in a building or something like that and it caught on fire, and then there's the physical damage due to fire. Or smoke inhalation would be another one. So what does primary blast injuries normally affect? It normally affects the ears, So you're getting, sudden loss of ear, tinnitus can be a huge problem, earache, dizziness. You can lose a lot of your balance. Usually you have that, sudden pop, or if you're hearing it, usually it's gone for a while, and then all of a sudden one day randomly it just comes back. Continue usually to have problems with sensitivity to noise. Can cause some lung issues. Basically, when a blast happens, it moves anything that has, air and airspace. So things within your lungs can tend to have issues. And hence the same thing with your ear canal too, because there's just that air in between it. And then in your abdomen, sometimes some air pockets of gases in there that can, get bruised, and then you can bruising against some of your stomach tissue. So secondary, or is coming from, objects flying at you. And just to give you an idea, your small objects flying from a blast, only need to travel 50 feet per second and call it the skin. In order to penetrate into the body, you're looking at something traveling at 400 feet per second. Now, the initial blast wave of a lot is coming at you at 1,600 feet per second. Obviously, it dissipates further and further away from that blast, but there's a lot of objects and debris that can be picked up and then thrown at you at a very high rate of speed, and then produces a lot of other injuries in conjunction with the traumatic brain injury. So looking at the tertiary ones, you're looking at shockwave being thrown, and multiple fractures, loss of limbs, a lot of broken bones, broken ribs, broken legs, depending on the location of the blast. And then you're also looking at burns associated with the explosion fire from it. And then looking at the last category, looking at a collapsed building, displaced heavy objects can fall on you, smoke and toxic fumes. You never know what's going to be caught up in that fire, and then breathing them can cause other issues. And then the burns themselves from something else catching on fire as a result of the explosion. This I wanted to show you at least, what it looks like to get a veteran from, we'll say a deployed environment all the way back to, a level 5 treatment facility. So you're looking at, if it happens out on the battlefield, you're looking at either a casevac, which is basically being put into a vehicle and moved to your first medical site, or you're being put on a helicopter and moved to a site. And usually that's around an hour. So sometimes you can be suffering out there with an hour until they're able to safely move you from the battlefield back to a site to be able to provide that initial level of care. Usually those initial level cares are your forward surgical teams, and then they're going to help, stabilize you as best as they can before they move you to the level 3 facility, which is usually at a couple of the larger bases within deployment zones. And then once you're stabilized there, they're going to fly you out to probably Landstuhl, which is the typical one in Germany. But you're looking at 24 to 72 hours before you're able to get to Landstuhl. So it's a long time before you're able to get that higher level of care. And then finally, you're going to move to probably either the Walter Reed or the San Antonio Army Medical Center, and for either further care, because they provide a lot more of the traumatic brain injury services. And then after that, it's going to be a slow transition to the VA, depending on your treatment at those sites. So, this can be a long process, and a lot of issues be going from place to place. But just to give you an idea of what it looks like to go from combat theater to care of service. So, what do we know about blast-related traumatic injury? Limited studies on the effects of it on the brain, so we're not exactly 100% sure on what it does. The physical, effects of it may differ from other mechanisms, but in the end, it doesn't suggest that there's really a different clinical outcome. I think your clinical outcome differences are usually more associated with the PTSD that's associated with it, and also with other injuries. So if it's a loss of limb, or even a loss of limb, broken bones, not being able to walk the same way again, it's those other injuries that kind of make it much more challenging. It's not always just the blast wave itself, it's everything that's associated with it. So how do veterans describe their experience with traumatic brain injuries? And for this section, a lot of this is coming from studies that have, actually asked veterans, and this is how they describe their experience. Now, these experiences may not be universal, where, all veterans feel the exact same thing, but they might be a good way to, at least summarize that experience for all of us to understand a little bit better. Feelings of reduced physical and mental function, you don't necessarily feel like you're able to do everything that you were able to do before. specifically with mental functions. Like one of my friends, when we were in Afghanistan, ended up having traumatic brain injury, and he described his memory as going from a super memory to an average memory, where he never needed to study for any test ever in school, to now that he needs to study and work harder and to be able to pass the same test. So you have these differences where, you have this great memory to a less of a function memory, and you know the difference between the two of them. You also have a lot of migraines, changes in memories, sensitivity to light, which definitely a big problem. If you look at a lot of rooms, you use fluorescent lights instead of natural lighting, and that fluorescent light tends to kind of flicker a little bit, which you may or may not notice, but people with traumatic brain injuries tend to get, a lot more headaches due to this. They feel that like staying active and physically active, going to school, these things are helpful, just trying to be as active as possible and try to recover as much of their previous activities in life as they can. They also feel there's a lack of community support, and this might tie back into, feeling like they're part of a community in the Army, that unit, that family, and everything else that's associated with that. So, and then suddenly losing all of that, you can kind of feel that your community support is never going to be exactly the same as in your unit. So that might explain some of that. And then they spend a lot of time researching treatments for themselves, especially compared to civilian populations, because, especially working in the VA, the VA, and having my own experiences with the VA, I have to spend a lot of time researching different options for treatment for myself. If there's something I want, I have to come in very well educated on it and why it works for me. And I think that's more unique to military populations, is coming in with that argument, this is a service I need and why. So not that, civilian populations don't do the same, but I think it's more conditioned within military people to do a lot more detail with it. You get changes to your health status, you're looking at your concentration changes, memory problems, usually a lot of short-term memory, increased irritability. I think one thing that people don't necessarily think about very often is, the changes in symptoms and new symptoms appearing after many years, and this happens rather commonly, and you're looking at more longitudinal studies that are starting to show this more and more, where you think you have everything under control, you're medicated for this, medicated for that, and then all of a sudden they don't work anymore, your personality starts changing a little bit, you develop new problems. And I think if you're looking at veterans with blast and other comorbid injuries, then that's a lot more problematic, of these things becoming more agitated and more irritated over time, and loss of function to these things, and can impact both the health and mental health. And then we'll talk about specific war zone stressors, and preparedness or lack thereof. It depends on how you feel you're going into all of this. So if you're prepared, you might be a little bit better off, or if you're multiple deployments. However, multiple deployments can also lead to higher anxiety, more PTSD symptoms. It can be combat exposure. There are units that are more exposed to different combat. It varies. Everybody's experience is different over there, where, some people may have more jobs working out of the bases, and where other people are more going out on patrols within areas that are more, have more likely exposure to combat and threats. You don't always get to process, we'll say, like the aftermath of the battle. Sometimes you're going from one mission to another mission to another mission, and you never really get to sit down and process that experience, so you're carrying that with you as well. And then there's that perceived threat, and coming back from Afghanistan, you tend to be more hyper-vigilant to a lot of things. You see things around you that you may not have noticed before, but were very important when you're in theater. So thinking of some other veterans that I know have talked about, you see trash lying on the road, where in deployment environments that might be a marker for an improvised explosive device coming up down the road. You don't know, and so you tend to be reactionary to things. And you're not always understanding what the threat is out there, or if there is no threat, and so that hypervigilance tends to remain. But you kind of need it when you're deployed, but it's a difficult switch to turn on. Difficult living and work environment. It's not very nice or comfortable in theater. You have long shifts, long days, every day. It's not like there's a day off that you get over there and you go from one thing to the next, and that gets more stress. This was originally written back from the Iraq War, and I think what it highlights here is that perceived radiological, biological, and chemical weapon exposure, which was a greater concern in the earlier parts of these wars whether they would actually use them or not use them. So you always had to be ready. You had to have that gear with you at all times. The alarm went off. You had to put on that gear rather quickly, and those alarms are rather sensitive, so they can sometimes go off when there is no exposure, but you're still rushing to get it on. So it increases the amount of stress that you're on, just fear of what those things can do to you. There also remains, sexual and gender harassment in the military, and then there's the ethno-cultural stressors. And so in my mind for this one, when I was going to Afghanistan, they talked about, how women were treated over there, that basically you should not look at the females over there. You need to basically just ignore them because, if they get too much attention, then they could have some negative, consequences for them when they got home. And that's nothing, you ever wanted to contribute to. So you kind of, had to completely ignore them while you were there. And then concerns about life and family disruption. Multiple deployments takes you away from your family. There's many times that people, miss the births of their children or other major life events just to having to be deployed. But it's, can be stressful at the same time to having to miss those. In this section, we wanted to talk about, caregivers. And I think, especially with TBI survivors, I want to point out some of the differences between both military and civilian populations on this one. They tend to be a little bit different, and I think it's worth mentioning. So let's define what a caregiver is. A caregiver is any family or support person relied upon by the service member, to assume responsibility for ensure their daily living necessities, make sure everything goes well with their well-being. A lot of them responsible for helping them return to the community, to family, to school or work, and help them go through any challenges. So what's the role? The role is basically you're the case manager, you're their advocate, you're benefits coordinator, which can be a very complicated process within the military, and at times you're even their healthcare provider. Just about anybody can be a caregiver. Sometimes it's the spouse, sometimes it's a parent, sibling, friends. There's been a variety of people that will take in veterans and be in this caregiver role. So, and this study was all with caregivers of veterans with traumatic brain injuries. So, looking at differences between military and civilian population, this came from the National Alliance for Caregiving in 2010. I couldn't find any new data on this, where some of this probably is changing just due to a lot of the funding changes, where, a lot of caregivers in civilian populations may be more returning to the home environment. So some of these numbers might be different, but this was the most current stuff I could find on it that, highlights the differences. So caregivers of veterans, 96% of the time they're female compared to 65% in civilian. With spouses, they are at 70% of the time as the primary caregiver compared to 6% for civilians. Looking at caregivers living with the recipient at 80% of the time in the military and 23% of the time with civilians. Primary caregiver, basically, where there's only one person doing it all the time. It's 82% in the military with 53% in civilian population. And then if you're looking at the same person providing care for 10 or more years, it's 30% of the time in the military with 15% of the time being in civilian populations. As you can see, those numbers are drastically higher. Talking about some of the emotional stress, the physical strain, and everything else, these things, you're also going to see some differences between veterans and, a national population where it's, high emotional stress. It's 68% higher rated at, on a 4-point scale that veterans are at 68%, where, civilians are at 31%. Physical strain is rated as higher, with 40%, with 14%. And then I think the other factor to consider is that there's a lot of people, caregivers, that give up on their goals, have early retirements just so that they can provide for their veterans. And that's higher with that 47% with the veterans compared to the 9% with the civilian population. And there's a high financial hardship. When you're looking at caregivers of veterans ranking that at 50% compared to the civilians at 13%. So there is this greater stress, I would say, that exists with military caregivers. More talk some of the uniqueness of it and comparing it to civilian population. This has been some self-report studies with military caregivers and then civilian populations, but they experience less family cohesiveness. They're not always as functional as they expect or want them to be. There's a lot of greater emotional distress, and there's a lot of mental health problems, greater financial strain. There's a lot of additional burdens associated with this, related to deployment and reintegration. I mean, not all traumatic brain injuries default to people being moved out of the military, but sometimes it creates additional challenges with that deployment and coming back again and going and deploying. And these are a lot of really unique situations there. And then, we're looking at repeat injuries. I mean, once you've had one traumatic brain injury, that increases the likelihood of having another traumatic brain injuries. And then you'd also want to talk about, service members tend to seek more risky behaviors or are prone to more risky behaviors and seek, more adventure things that can, increase risk. So whether it's through sports or physical activities, they tend to do a lot more risky actions that increase the likelihood of additional traumatic brain injuries. So what do caregivers describe as their unmet needs? I think this is an important one to talk about. There's a lot of unmet needs that they feel. With health information, they don't always have access to the patient's medical problems or care, all the detailed medical records. So, and getting that from the military can be a very challenging process. And, they're not always as informative on this is the steps that we need to take in order to get them, the best care possible. So, they feel that there's a lack of information that they're receiving. So they feel like there's a lack of emotional support. They don't feel like there's people to discuss their feelings with or have others that understand the challenges. Instrumental support, so getting, equipment, maybe wheelchair or ramp access or, going unmet. Professional support, you're looking at adequate resources, things that help the patient. So whether it's, physical therapy, occupational therapy, it can be really difficult to be able to get. Feel that there's issues within the community support network, no others to turn to, and no one understand the patient's problems. So it can be difficult and difficulty to find, some sort of support group for them to be able to work with each other. And then they involvement with care. I mean, they don't always feel like they're being told what's going on, what's being done for their survivor, and feel that their opinions aren't always valued. And those have been some of the struggles that they've talked about with being a caregiver for veterans. So some of the other ways that they've described this experience, I mean, they can be eligible for a stipend. They have to be applied through the VA, but the VA can be really a difficult program to navigate, but they at times will be offered a stipend. However, there are also, general feelings of pride and respect for the sacrifices of their loved ones and that made for their country. And I think that's an important one to remember, and that's usually an important one for the veteran, that the pride and what they did and, their love of their country. There's also a lot of anger, and usually a lot of this is directed towards the military and VA healthcare systems because they just can be, really difficult to access and understand, and oftentimes they don't always feel like they do enough for them. They feel like, appointments can be a disruption and financial benefits or complaints. They get random appointments from the VA that might be difficult to meet. VA hospitals, while it is the largest healthcare network in the United States, it's not always at convenient locations, and it can be very difficult, to drive. We'll say that 1 hour, 2 hour, 3 hour. Now, the VA has made efforts to reduce this burden, but it hasn't always worked out. So this can be, a source of anger for caregivers as they're trying to get all the support that they need, but it can be very challenging. Additional experience, a large portion of them, report numerous unmet healthcare and social service needs. Basically, their own health is not always being serviced, and they have to make the sacrifices along their own health needs in order to make sure that their veteran is getting theirs. Another big one is they don't receive any training on how to navigate the VA and DoD benefits or medical system, and those things are very complicated. Now, I will say when I left active duty and transitioned to the reserve, there was a bunch of training on how to navigate the VA system, making sure everything got transferred over, but that was a military briefing, and I don't remember seeing any of the spouses in these meetings, so they didn't have necessarily that education that the veteran might have. So there needs to be a little bit probably more on this is how the system works, this is how we can help you navigate through it. And then there's this unaware of what to expect from their loved ones. I mean, how well will they get? I mean, I mean, there's not always a ceiling. People can constantly improve, but what should those expectations be? And sometimes they're not always made aware of what those expectations are going to be from the primary care providers. Veterans tend to be impulsive, and there's spending habits, and that can affect all the family finances. Especially coming back from a deployment, veterans usually have this large amount of income that they haven't been able to spend due to being deployed, and then they tend to be very impulsive with their purchasing. This is very common, and this can continue over, after they leave the military, where they may not have the same access to funds that they had before, and this impulsive spending can cause a lot of strain in the family. So if we're looking at some of the impacts on the military, you're looking at impacts on, their social health, their emotional health, physical, medical health, and their cognitive health. So looking at these specifically, some of the common concerns, usually come back with trouble with finances and giving up on a career. I think that's one of the bigger challenges, is to give up on a career so that you can be able to serve that veteran. So. And it changes a lot of the social roles in the relationships in the family, where one person might have been doing all the finances before, but after the traumatic brain injury, they're no longer able to do all the finances, or someone was more of the disciplinarian in the family and becomes less of the disciplinarian. So a lot of the roles and responsibilities can change in the family. There's a lot of family disruption. There's a lot of research with children of people with traumatic brain injuries, and some of the challenges they have to face trying to understand the changes in their parent as they're going through all of this, and that can be very challenging for children. So looking at emotional health, you're looking at some of that strain, that feeling of loss, anger, depression, anxiety. And they tend to be hypervigilant as well, and I think this is worth a little bit more discussion. They're monitoring their own behavior heavily, because oftentimes people with a traumatic brain injury have some emotional regulation issues. They're not able to control emotional outbursts as well, so they kind of have to watch their own behavior, because they know what may or may not set off the survivor, and obviously we want to avoid that. But, they also watch the behaviors of other individuals, because they don't want them to set off the TBI survivor as well. So you're hypervigilant of anybody else that comes around it. And then as well as just being hypervigilant of the service member, you can kind of see things building with a person that's had a traumatic brain injury. So you kind of have to, work on, redirecting or coming back to things. So, it's this constant watching of everything around them, contributes to a lot of that, strain, burden, depression, and anxiety. So looking at some of the physical and medical health, you're looking at lifestyle choices. Things have changed. Diet and exercises, where you might have regularly gone to the gym. Actually, every morning we're no longer able to go to the gym regularly. So that kind of, ends up having some physical and medical health. Also impacts your mental health too. Lifestyle choices, diet, and exercise also have a very high relationship with your mental health. You can have difficulties in, following up with your own medical care due to being that primary caregiver. In addition to, especially with spouses, there's that intimacy and sexual life with their partner where that can be impacted, as well as then leading into fatigue and sleep difficulties. Looking at some of the cognitive health, not feeling as sharp, and it's kind of due to exhaustion, depression, and anxiety. So, always feeling it. And then oftentimes there's this co-mentality, I guess to put it, would be like a feeling like you both have shared that traumatic brain injury proxy. That, we both talk about having a traumatic brain injury, even though it really was only the one person that had a traumatic brain injury. But you kind of share that experience with each other, which kind of, can impact your own mental health. So last section, we want to talk about some resources. So just places for veterans to be able to reach out to. Obviously, realwarriors.net is a live chat that people are able to talk with, and I'm pretty sure that is with other veterans, so it gives the veteran experience to talk with a veteran, which can sometimes be a little bit more beneficial. There's the military crisis line, psychological health resource center, though I didn't really touch on it in this talk, but there is a high suicide with people that have had traumatic brain injury, so the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline's there. That's a resource to use. Additional information, there's a lot of places you can go for additional information on dealing with traumatic brain injuries. The West Virginia University Center for Excellence in Disabilities has a lot of information. Brain Injury Association of America, Defense and Veterans Brain Injury Center, and then Department of Veteran Affairs, Wounded Warrior Project, just to name a few of the ones on the list there, but they all provide some great resources. And then the resources for where all this information came from in this presentation. And a few more of them. And that concludes my talk. I hope you found this informative and interesting. Thank you.